conquest of the Americas was a complex event where European explorers overthrew advanced indigenous civilizations in the late 1400s. Europeans often justified their actions by claiming divine approval or a mission to civilize native peoples, despite the rich cultures, languages, and governments already present. Initial encounters involved curiosity and trade, but quickly turned violent as Europeans sought land, wealth, and resources like gold and silver. Leaders such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro used military force, strategic alliances, and sometimes deception to defeat powerful empires like the Aztecs and Incas. A major factor in the conquest was disease. Illnesses like smallpox devastated indigenous populations who had no immunity, weakening societies and making conquest easier. Europeans also had advantages in technology, including firearms and steel weapons, while indigenous peoples relied on traditional arms. Alliances with rival native groups further helped Europeans gain power, often leading to betrayal and conflict among indigenous peoples themselves. Cultural misunderstandings worsened relations, as Europeans dismissed native social and political systems as primitive. The conquest caused massive destruction, forced labor, and the imposition of European religion and language. It displaced many indigenous people from their homelands, causing lasting loss of identity and autonomy, a legacy still felt today. The motivations behind European exploration included economic goals like finding new trade routes to Asia and acquiring luxury goods, religious aims to spread Christianity after the Reconquista, and political competition among European nations to claim new territories. Treaties such as the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the lands between Spain and Portugal, showing how exploration was also a strategic move for power competition among European powers, such as France, England, and the Netherlands, drove further exploration as each nation aimed to build colonies and extend their influence in the New World. Alongside these political motives, advances in navigation and shipbuilding made these voyages possible. The development of the caravel, a ship capable of sailing against the wind, along with improved tools like the astrolabe and magnetic compass, gave explorers the confidence to sail into unknown seas. These innovations were crucial for the successful journeys that led to the discovery of the Americas. The Renaissance also fueled a thirst for knowledge and discovery. Scholars and navigators were eager to explore geography, cultures, and the natural world, pushing Europe toward these bold expeditions. Columbus and the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, it marked the beginning of major changes for the indigenous peoples, especially the Taíno, the main inhabitants of the Greater Antilles. Initially, encounters were peaceful, with the Taíno showing hospitality and exchanging gifts with the newcomers. However, the arrival of Europeans quickly brought tragedy. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, unknown to the indigenous peoples, spread rapidly, causing devastating epidemics that wiped out many communities. Without immunity, these diseases had catastrophic effects. Columbus's voyages also triggered waves of colonization and exploitation. The Spanish sought gold and other valuable resources, leading to the enslavement of many indigenous people. The encomienda system allowed Spanish settlers to force native populations into labor, often under brutal conditions. Large plantations, especially sugarcane fields, required extensive labor, further burdening the Taino and other groups. European goods and animals introduced new elements to the Caribbean. While metal tools and firearms were beneficial, they disrupted traditional lifestyles. Domesticated animals like pigs and horses altered ecosystems, competing for resources and changing hunting and farming practices. The Spanish colonists imposed their language, religion, and culture, often through force, suppressing native beliefs and creating lasting cultural conflicts. Wider impact of Columbus's arrival. Columbus's arrival set off a chain reaction of colonization across the Americas, leading to violent conflicts and the near extinction of many indigenous populations. The demographic and cultural upheaval allowed Europeans to dominate the region and marginalize native peoples, reshaping the continent's history forever. Notable indigenous civilizations encountered by the Spanish. During the early conquests, Spanish explorers met several powerful and complex indigenous civilizations. The Aztec Empire. Located in present-day central Mexico, the Aztecs were known for their stunning architecture, including huge pyramids in their capital, Tenochtitlan, which sat on an island in Lake Texcoco. The Aztec society had a rigid social hierarchy, a strong military and religious practices involving human sacrifice, believed necessary to please their gods. Hernán Cortés' arrival in 1519 marked a turning point, as he used military strength, alliances with rival tribes, and the devastating impact of disease to bring about the fall of the Aztec Empire by 1520. The Inca Empire. Stretching along the western coast of South America, mainly in modern-day Peru, the Incas were master engineers, famous for their extensive road network and the breathtaking city of Machu Picchu in the Andes Mountains. Their society was highly organized, with a centralized government and unique agricultural techniques like terrace farming. In the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro led a Spanish expedition that captured and executed the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, leading to the empire's swift collapse and Spanish domination of the region. Native American groups in North America. Spanish explorers also encountered groups like the Pueblo peoples in the southwest. The Pueblo built distinctive adobe homes and developed a complex society based on agriculture, trade, and spiritual traditions centered on Kachina beliefs. Explorers like Francisco Vázquez de Coronado would later interact with these communities during their expeditions. In the 1540s, Spanish explorer Francisco Vázquez de Coronado embarked on expeditions to explore and conquer parts of what is now the southwestern United States. These efforts often resulted in violent conflicts over land and resources with various indigenous groups. Meanwhile, in the southeastern United States, the Mississippian culture flourished. Known for constructing large earthworks and mound complexes, Cahokia was one of the most important pre-Columbian urban centers in North America. The Mississippians developed advanced agricultural techniques, maintained extensive trade networks, and organized their societies under complex chiefdoms. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was a dramatic, multifaceted process that unfolded between 1519 and 1521. At the center was Hernán Cortés, a determined Spanish conquistador driven by the promise of gold and glory. Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with about 600 men, intent on exploration and conquest. Accompanying Cortés were important figures such as Pedro de Alvarado and La Malinche, a native woman who served as interpreter, advisor, and intermediary, helping to bridge cultural and linguistic divides between the Spaniards and indigenous peoples. Upon arrival, Cortés encountered various indigenous groups, including those who were rivals of the Aztecs. Forming alliances with these groups, especially the Tlaxcalans, proved essential to his campaign. The Tlaxcalans provided warriors and valuable local knowledge that significantly strengthened Cortés's forces. The conquest was not simply a straightforward military battle, but a series of calculated strategies, betrayals, and clashes. In 1519, Cortés advanced to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, where Emperor Moctezuma II initially welcomed him, mistakenly viewing Cortés as a returning god. This fragile hospitality soon gave way to tension and conflict. In 1520, events escalated to what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, when the Aztecs rebelled and forced the Spanish to retreat with heavy losses. Demonstrating resilience, Cortés regrouped and returned with reinforcements. The siege of Tenochtitlan followed, eventually leading to the fall of the Aztec Empire. Devastating impact of European diseases. One of the most catastrophic effects of European contact was the spread of diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. Illnesses previously unknown to the indigenous populations of the Americas. With no immunity, entire communities were decimated. Historical evidence suggests mortality rates in some indigenous populations reached as high as 90% within a few decades after contact. The massive loss of life disrupted social structures, the deaths of elders, the keepers of cultural knowledge, and many young adults led to a profound weakening of these societies, making resistance to European colonization much more difficult. European settlers further facilitated the spread of diseases as they moved deeper into indigenous territories, displacing native populations and accelerating epidemics. Trade networks and alliances among indigenous groups also helped diseases spread rapidly across vast regions. This tragic loss of life altered the course of history by easing European conquest and domination. The legacy of these epidemics continues to impact indigenous communities today. European technology and military advantage. The arrival of European technology profoundly affected indigenous peoples' ability to resist conquest. Europeans brought advanced weapons, guns, cannons, and steel swords that far outmatched the traditional weapons such as bows, arrows, and stone tools used by many indigenous groups. Additionally, European ships designed for oceanic travel enabled quick and large-scale movement of troops and supplies, supporting sustained military campaigns that indigenous groups could not effectively counter. This technological edge, combined with alliances and disease, significantly contributed to the rapid European takeover of large parts of the Americas. The arrival of horses in the Americas marked a major transformation for many indigenous tribes. Initially seen as a novelty, horses quickly revolutionized warfare and hunting by providing tribes that adopted them with increased mobility and efficiency. Those groups without access to horses or similar technologies often found themselves at a disadvantage in both conflict and resource acquisition. In addition to horses, European communication networks allowed for the coordination of military and administrative efforts over vast distances, giving European powers a strategic advantage. Alliances between Europeans and certain indigenous tribes, who often acted as allies and scouts, further complicated resistance, as opposing indigenous groups found themselves divided. At the same time, devastating diseases like smallpox drastically reduced indigenous populations, severely weakening their ability to organize and defend their territories. With many warriors lost, it became increasingly difficult for communities to mount effective resistance. This combination of superior technology, strategic alliances, and disease created a perfect storm that undermined indigenous societies' capacity to resist conquest. Some indigenous groups attempted to adapt by crafting weapons from iron and steel and learning to use firearms. However, the rapid pace of European military innovation made it difficult to keep up. Social and political structures were also disrupted, as Europeans often exploited existing rivalries or created new divisions, further fracturing indigenous resistance. Although many indigenous peoples showed remarkable resilience and adaptability, the overwhelming advantages of European colonizers largely diminished their ability to resist effectively, resulting in profound and often tragic changes to their societies. The Inca Empire, Society and Governance. The Inca Empire, which thrived in South America from the early 15th century until the Spanish invasion in the 16th century, had a complex and highly organized social and political structure. At the top of this hierarchy was the Sapa Inca, who was both the political leader and a divine figure, believed to be a direct descendant of the sun god. The Sapa Inca wielded absolute power, overseeing military, political, and religious affairs. The empire's religion emphasized the Sapa Inca's role as a mediator between the gods and the people. Beneath the Sapa Inca was a noble class known as the Inca elite, who managed administration, military, and religious duties. These nobles were often relatives of the Sapa Inca, forming a tight-knit ruling class that maintained loyalty and stability. The empire was divided into 4 major regions called suyus, each governed by a local leader or apu, who reported to the Sapa Inca. This administrative division enabled efficient governance and resource management across the vast territory, which stretched from modern-day Ecuador to Chile. The Incas implemented a labor tax system known as the mita, requiring conquered peoples to contribute labor, goods, or military service. This system supported ambitious construction projects like roads and temples, and facilitated resource redistribution to even remote communities. Inca society was hierarchical, with nobility at the top, followed by commoners called runa, who were primarily farmers and craftsmen. The Incas valued collective effort and community cooperation, emphasizing reciprocity, where families helped one another, especially during planting and harvesting seasons. The Ailu, a form of community organization, was central to social life, with families working communal lands and sharing resources. Land was considered communal property, allocated by the government to families to encourage agricultural productivity and reinforce social bonds. Religion deeply influenced Inca social and political life, intertwining governance with spiritual beliefs. Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Francisco Pizarro, born around 1470 in Spain, is best known for leading the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire in the early 16th century. Pizarro arrived in the New World and initially settled in present-day Panama, where he participated in exploration and conquest. Driven by ambition and the desire for wealth, he set his sights on the Inca Empire, one of South America's most advanced civilizations. Pizarro's strategy was multifaceted. Alliances with rival groups, he formed alliances with indigenous groups hostile to the Incas. These alliances provided critical intelligence about Inca strengths and weaknesses, and supplied additional warriors to support Spanish forces, especially in the difficult Andean terrain. Technological superiority. Pizarro's men carried steel swords, crossbows and firearms, which were far superior to the Incas' traditional weapons like wooden clubs and slings. This gave the Spanish a decisive edge in battle, despite being outnumbered, exploiting internal conflict. At the time of the Spanish arrival, the Inca Empire was embroiled in a civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huasca, fighting for the throne. Pizarro exploited this division by capturing Atahualpa in a surprise attack during the Battle of Cajamarca in 1532. After capturing Atahualpa, Pizarro demanded a huge ransom in gold and silver, which the Incas paid. However, Pizarro ultimately executed Atahualpa, further destabilizing Inca leadership. Pizarro's conquest was also marked by psychological warfare. The Incas were terrified by unfamiliar European technology, armoured soldiers and horses, which they had never seen before. This fear and confusion contributed to the collapse of Inca resistance. European settlers, particularly from England and France, held a worldview that tied land ownership to legal titles and individual rights. Land was treated like a commodity, something that could be bought, sold, and inherited. This approach was influenced by feudal systems and emerging capitalist ideas, where land was a resource to be exploited for economic gain. Property laws emphasized individual ownership, often enforced by the state. Settlers saw land as something to be claimed, cultivated, and fundamentally transformed to suit their needs and aspirations. This often meant clearing forests, farming large plots, and establishing permanent settlements, reshaping the landscape entirely. In contrast, many indigenous tribes held a communal view of land, seeing it as a shared resource integral to their cultural identity and spiritual beliefs. Land was not owned as private property, but regarded as a living entity imbued with deep significance. Indigenous peoples understood the land as interconnected with their way of life, meant to be cared for and stewarded, rather than possessed outright. This stewardship emphasized ecological balance and sustainability, with communities collectively responsible for land management. Families worked together through communal organizations such as the Ailu, promoting cooperation and shared responsibility. As European settlers expanded, these contrasting views led to significant conflicts. Settlers often disregarded indigenous concepts of land use, imposing European legal frameworks that misunderstood or ignored traditional practices. Treaties made with indigenous tribes were frequently broken or manipulated, resulting in the forcible removal of many indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands through legal trickery, violence, and military force. The clash of cultures not only caused massive land loss for indigenous peoples, but also profoundly altered landscapes, biodiversity, and ecosystems. European agricultural practices introduced new species and changed land use patterns in ways unfamiliar to indigenous communities. These conflicts also raised complex questions about sovereignty, rights, and justice, as indigenous peoples continued to seek recognition and restoration of their lands and autonomy. The legacy of these differing views on land ownership still influences debates over land rights, conservation, and indigenous sovereignty today. The encomienda system. Exploitation and its consequences. The encomienda system, established by the Spanish crown in the early 16th century, had devastating consequences for indigenous populations in the Americas. Under this system, Spanish settlers, known as encomiendos, were granted the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities. In return, encomiendos were supposed to provide protection and religious instruction, promises rarely fulfilled. but in reality the system led to widespread exploitation and abuse. Indigenous peoples were subjected to forced labor under brutal conditions, particularly in mines and plantations. This exploitation, combined with malnutrition and devastating European diseases like smallpox, caused dramatic population declines. The encomienda system also disrupted indigenous social structures and cultures. Many communities were uprooted from their lands and forced into labor, leading to loss of ancestral territory and erosion of cultural practices and languages. Indigenous peoples were pressured to adopt Spanish customs and religion, often at great cost to their traditional identities. Economically, the system benefited mainly the Spanish crown and encomenderos, while indigenous populations were impoverished and marginalized. The encomienda system was a tool of colonization that established a colonial economy dependent on indigenous labor. As Spain expanded its empire, the system was replicated in new territories, further encroaching on indigenous lands and resources. The legacy of the encomienda system persists today, with many indigenous groups continuing to fight for recognition, rights, and restitution. Justifications for Spanish conquest and colonization. The Spanish crown justified its conquest and colonization of indigenous lands through religious, political, and economic arguments, reflecting the prevailing attitudes of the time. Doctrine of discovery. This concept held that Christian nations had the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples. It was rooted in the belief that Christians had a duty to spread their faith. The Spanish crown saw itself as a defender of the Catholic Church, especially after the Reconquista, when Muslim rule was expelled from Spain. Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella received papal support, most notably through the 1493 papal bull Inter Caetera issued by Pope Alexander VI, which granted Spain rights to conquer and evangelize the New World. Indigenous peoples were often portrayed as savages or barbarians in need of guidance and civilization. This paternalistic view rationalized the imposition of European customs, governance, and religion as a moral obligation to civilize. The idea of civilizing justified brutal methods such as forced labor and violent suppression of resistance, all framed as bringing progress and enlightenment. Economic motives were significant. The Spanish crown sought wealth from vast New World resources like gold and silver. Extracted wealth would enrich Spain and fund further exploration and military campaigns, reinforcing Spain's position as a leading global power. Politically, colonization was justified as a means to secure territory and influence against rival European powers like Portugal, France, and England. The encomienda system was a practical manifestation of these justifications, but resulted in extensive suffering and demographic decline among indigenous populations. The conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires were greatly aided by indigenous allies who provided essential military support, intelligence, and knowledge of local geography. Leaders like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro relied on these alliances to defeat powerful empires. Indigenous groups joined Europeans to gain advantages over rivals and secure promises of land or autonomy. These allies also helped with communication, logistics, and cultural exchange. Interpreters like Doña Marina played a key role in negotiations. Indigenous knowledge helped Europeans navigate the land, secure resources, and establish trade routes. Cultural exchange. The early colonial period saw a blend of European and indigenous cultures. Europeans introduced new farming methods and animals, while indigenous peoples, shared important crops like maize, potatoes, and tobacco. Religious beliefs mixed, creating new hybrid traditions. Language exchange helped trade and diplomacy, though colonization also brought devastating diseases and social upheaval. Conflicts over land and power led to violence and displacement. Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas divided newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal to avoid conflict. Spain claimed lands west of a set line, focusing on the Americas, while Portugal controlled lands to the east, including Brazil, Africa, and Asia. This treaty shaped colonization patterns, trade routes, and the spread of Christianity. It set a model for future agreements, but was later challenged by other European powers. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, divided new lands between Spain and Portugal, but was often disputed as other European nations explored the Americas. Its legacy shaped colonial boundaries and influenced future conflicts. Religious motivations of European explorers. Many explorers, driven by a desire to spread Christianity, especially Catholicism, viewed their missions as divine. This justified their conquest and harsh treatment of indigenous peoples. Spanish conquistadors like Cortés and Pizarro were often accompanied by missionaries aiming to convert natives, blending religion with colonization. Different countries had varied approaches. The French often sought trade and alliances, while Protestant England and the Netherlands aimed to establish new social orders based on their beliefs, creating complex alliances. Indigenous resistance. Indigenous peoples resisted European conquest through warfare, guerrilla tactics, alliances, and diplomacy. Groups like the Aztecs and Incas fought fiercely, while others preserved cultural and spiritual traditions or negotiated treaties to maintain some autonomy. Spanish propaganda and justification. Spain used religious rhetoric, exaggerated accounts, and legal documents to justify their conquests. The Church supported these efforts by framing conquest as a holy mission. Chronicles, maps, and laws, like the Laws of the Indies, painted indigenous peoples as savage, legitimizing Spanish rule and exploitation. Ecological impact. European colonization deeply affected the Americas' environment and agriculture, reshaping the land and societies. When European settlers arrived in the late 15th century, they introduced new crops like wheat, barley, and rice, replacing traditional indigenous staples such as maize, beans, and squash. They also brought livestock, cattle, pigs, and sheep, that grazed extensively, causing overgrazing, soil degradation, and loss of native plants. Forests were cleared for fields and pastures, leading to habitat loss and soil erosion. European farming often relied on monoculture, reducing biodiversity and increasing vulnerability to pests and diseases, which later demanded chemical use. Indigenous sustainable farming methods were largely displaced, and new pests and diseases further disrupted local ecosystems. The transatlantic slave trade expanded plantation agriculture, focused on cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which harmed the environment and indigenous economies. Impact on indigenous lifestyles and economies. European livestock transformed indigenous life. In the Americas, horses improved mobility and hunting skills, especially for Plains Indians. However, livestock competed with native wildlife, reducing food sources and introducing new diseases that devastated indigenous populations. Some indigenous groups shifted to sedentary farming due to grazing land demands, conflicting with their traditional nomadic lifestyles. In Australia, sheep farming led to land conflicts with Aboriginal peoples, impacting their hunting and gathering. Indigenous economies adapted by trading livestock, but became increasingly dependent on European goods, destabilizing traditional, social, and cultural systems. Role of the Catholic Church in colonization. The Catholic Church was a powerful force in the Americas' colonization, providing moral justification through papal bulls like Inter Caetera that granted Spain and Portugal rights to claim new lands. The Church framed conquest as a divine mission to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Missionaries from orders like the Franciscans, Jesuits, and Dominicans evangelized natives, often setting up missions and converting thousands. While sometimes protective, their efforts also suppressed indigenous cultures and religions, leading to loss of traditions and languages. The Church justified violent conquest through ideas like just war theology, supporting brutal campaigns against native peoples. Despite this, the Church also contributed positively by establishing schools and hospitals. Spanish Crown's response to indigenous uprisings. As indigenous resistance grew in the 16th and 17th centuries due to harsh labor and exploitation, the Spanish Crown sought to manage unrest to maintain control over its empire. Spanish colonial responses to indigenous uprisings. The Spanish Crown faced frequent indigenous uprisings fueled by forced Christian conversions and encroachment on native lands. To manage these, the Crown used military force, diplomacy, and legal reforms aimed at both suppressing rebellion and appeasing indigenous leaders. One key tool was the requerimiento, a legal document demanding indigenous submission and justifying Spanish claims. Although often ignored by native peoples, it symbolized the Crown's assertion of authority. Military campaigns, such as the brutal suppression of the Pueblo Revolt 1680 in New Mexico, demonstrated Spain's willingness to use force to re-establish control. The Crown also pursued alliances with some indigenous groups, offering privileges or protection in exchange for support against rival tribes or colonial threats. This strategy sought to maintain stability amid ongoing resistance. Reforms, like the new laws of 1542, attempted to limit abuses within the encomienda system and protect indigenous labourers. But enforcement was uneven due to conflicts between royal policies and local settlers' interests. Additionally, Spanish authorities controlled narratives around indigenous resistance, portraying it as savage to justify colonial rule and maintain legitimacy, despite criticism from religious figures who advocated for native rights. The Columbian Exchange, Transformations and Consequences. Following Columbus's voyages, the Columbian Exchange dramatically reshaped both the New World, the Americas, and the Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa. In the New World, European crops, wheat, rice, sugarcane, and livestock, horses, cattle, pigs, transformed indigenous diets, farming, and lifestyles. Horses revolutionized transportation, hunting, and trade for many Native American tribes. However, new diseases like smallpox and influenza devastated indigenous populations, with mortality rates as high as 90% in some communities, drastically disrupting social and cultural structures. The exchange also introduced cash crop plantations reliant on enslaved African labor, deeply impacting local environments and societies. In the Old World, new crops such as potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and cacao reshaped diets, agriculture and economies. Potatoes notably boosting population growth. Cultural imports like chocolate and tobacco affected European lifestyles and social customs. The exchange fueled global trade, wealth accumulation, capitalism, and imperial expansion. It also facilitated the transatlantic slave trade, creating lasting social and economic inequalities. Cultural and ideological contexts of colonization. The Columbian exchange was more than a transfer of goods. It was a complex cultural encounter. Indigenous peoples profoundly shaped European perceptions of conquest by challenging and influencing colonial attitudes. Europeans justified conquest through beliefs in their own cultural and religious superiority, seeing themselves as civilizers with a divine mission to spread Christianity and improve indigenous savage societies. These ideas grew from Renaissance humanism and Enlightenment ideals about reason, progress, and individual rights, paradoxically dismissing indigenous cultures as primitive. European narratives often depicted indigenous peoples as either noble savages to be uplifted or dangerous obstacles to be controlled, reinforcing stereotypes that justified violence and domination. A civilizing mission became a powerful ideological tool, giving colonization a sense of historical destiny, evident in concepts like the United States Manifest Destiny. Long-term impacts on indigenous languages and cultures. European colonization imposed new languages, customs, and beliefs on indigenous populations, frequently suppressing traditional practices. The result has been a complex history marked by oppression, resilience, and adaptation, with indigenous cultures continuing to evolve despite centuries of colonial disruption. European colonization led to the widespread marginalization of indigenous languages, many of which declined as colonial languages became dominant. For example, in North America, around 300 indigenous languages have become extinct since European contact, with many others endangered. The loss of language went hand in hand with cultural suppression. Traditional ceremonies, storytelling, and oral knowledge transmission were disrupted as colonial authorities imposed new governance and education systems, prioritizing European languages and histories. In Australia, British colonization severely impacted Aboriginal languages and cultures. Children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in institutions where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing traditions. Indigenous resilience and language revitalization. Despite these challenges, many indigenous communities have shown remarkable resilience. Worldwide efforts to revive indigenous languages and cultures have grown, including language immersion programs, community-led initiatives, and the use of technology like apps and social media. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission emphasized preserving Indigenous languages as a path toward healing and restoring identity, prompting increased government support for revitalization efforts. Language is deeply tied to culture, identity, and worldview. Losing a language often means losing unique cultural narratives, ecological knowledge, and philosophical concepts that cannot be fully translated into colonial languages, further eroding Indigenous heritage. Impact of plantation economies in the Caribbean. The rise of plantation economies in the Caribbean had devastating effects on Indigenous populations. Upon arrival, Europeans encountered complex societies rich in culture and resources, but introduced diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, which decimated native populations with no immunity. As demand for sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops grew in the 17th century, Europeans initially enslaved indigenous peoples. but their population decline made them insufficient labor sources. This led to the importation of enslaved Africans, fueling the transatlantic slave trade. Indigenous communities were marginalized, displaced from ancestral lands, subjected to violence, and forced into poverty. Plantation economies drastically altered environments by clearing large tracts of land, destroying ecosystems, reducing biodiversity through monoculture. Social hierarchies entrenched European planter dominance over both enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, pushing indigenous communities to the societal margins and threatening their cultural survival. Comparing French, British and Spanish colonial strategies. European powers employed distinct colonization methods shaped by their goals and historical contexts. Spanish. Known for aggressive, often brutal tactics, including the encomienda system, which exploited indigenous labor. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro used military force combined with political alliances to overthrow large empires, Aztec and Inca. Their strategy prioritized immediate wealth extraction, especially gold and silver. French focused on trade and alliances, particularly in North America. The French established fur trading networks through diplomacy and cooperation with indigenous peoples, leading to smaller, integrated settlements, e.g., Quebec. Their approach emphasized mutual benefit over domination. British varied by region, combining permanent settlements with conflict. British colonists often displaced indigenous peoples through treaties and military force. Colonies like Jamestown aimed at agricultural expansion, resulting in more confrontational relations compared to the French. Early British strategies prioritized land acquisition and resource control, while the French leaned towards collaboration and trade. The British were more expansionist and aggressive. Both sometimes resorted to military action, but their overall approaches contrasted with the Spanish focus on military conquest and resource extraction, indigenous adaptation to European technologies and goods. During colonization, indigenous peoples gradually incorporated European technologies and goods that proved useful. For example, metal tools like knives and axes often replaced traditional stone tools, reflecting selective adaptation amid a period of disruption and change. Indigenous peoples selectively adopted European tools and goods that improved their daily lives. Metal tools like knives and axes were more durable and efficient than traditional stone tools, enhancing hunting, farming, and crafting techniques. Textiles made from cotton or wool replaced animal hides, offering new styles and comforts appreciated by many groups. The introduction of horses transformed the lifestyles of many plains tribes by increasing mobility and hunting efficiency, enabling them to cover greater distances quickly. This also influenced social structures and trade networks. Firearms profoundly impacted indigenous communities. Those who acquired guns gained advantages in hunting and conflicts, shifting power balances among tribes and with European settlers. However, reliance on European goods sometimes led to a decline in traditional skills and practices, creating complex dependencies, agricultural changes and trade dynamics. Some indigenous communities incorporated European farming techniques and crops like wheat and barley, blending these with their traditional agriculture. This exchange resulted in more diverse farming practices, increasing food production and supporting population growth. However, these changes were often driven by necessity, as colonization altered land ownership and resource access, forcing indigenous peoples to adapt while preserving cultural identity. In trade, indigenous groups acted as intermediaries between European settlers and other tribes, creating new economic opportunities but also intensifying competition. The arrival of European goods such as beads, firearms and alcohol altered social dynamics, shifting power structures within communities. Some tribes embraced these changes to strengthen their traditions, while others resisted to protect their traditions. Overall, indigenous adaptation was a nuanced process involving negotiation, resistance, and selective incorporation, resulting in hybrid cultures that blended heritage and foreign influences. The role of slavery in colonization. Slavery was central to the European conquest and colonization of the Americas, deeply intertwined with economic, social, and political factors. European powers, Spain, Portugal, England, and France, claimed territories rich in resources like gold, silver, and fertile land, but faced a labor shortage. Initially, indigenous populations were seen as labor sources, but were devastated by European diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Consequently, Europeans turned to Africa, establishing the transatlantic slave trade that forcibly transported millions of Africans under brutal conditions. Slave labor was crucial for cultivating cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which fueled the colonial economy and enriched European nations. Caribbean sugar plantations depended almost entirely on enslaved Africans, creating a cycle of exploitation central to colonial enterprises. Social and legal legacies of slavery. The plantation system created rigid social hierarchies based on race and labor. Enslaved Africans were denied basic rights, and slavery became codified in law, laying the foundation for enduring racial discrimination. European colonizers justified their actions with notions of religious and cultural superiority, claiming to civilize indigenous peoples and Africans despite the brutal realities. As colonies expanded, so did the demand for land, leading to further displacement and destruction of indigenous cultures. Enslaved labor was also used in mining and infrastructure development, further cementing European dominance. The demographic impact was profound, resulting in diverse societies with deep-rooted African and indigenous histories, indigenous political and economic agency. Before and after European arrival, indigenous peoples in North America had established complex trade and political systems. They engaged with European settlers in various ways, showing adaptability and agency. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy used political alliances and military strength to negotiate trade agreements effectively, often playing rival European powers against one another to maximize benefits. Indigenous groups valued their land and resources and strategically engaged in trade, exchanging furs, food, and materials for European goods like firearms, metal tools, and textiles. This exchange was often balanced, with indigenous peoples leveraging their knowledge and negotiating favorable terms. They developed extensive trade networks linking tribes and communities, facilitating goods and information flow. Some tribes formed alliances with European settlers for strategic advantages against rival tribes, with alliances shifting based on changing circumstances, diplomacy, and treaty. Indigenous peoples actively participated in diplomacy with Europeans, engaging in treaties intended to define land rights and trade agreements. However, these treaties were often misunderstood, ignored, or broken by settlers, leading to conflicts and further tensions. Indigenous groups adopted European tools because they were more durable and efficient. improving hunting, farming, and crafting techniques. Textiles made from cotton or wool began to replace traditional animal hides, offering new styles and comforts that many indigenous people appreciated. The introduction of horses by Europeans transformed the lifestyles of many plains tribes by enhancing their mobility and hunting capabilities, allowing them to cover greater distances quickly. This change also influenced social structures and trade networks. The arrival of firearms profoundly affected indigenous power dynamics. Tribes that acquired guns gained advantages in hunting and conflicts, altering the balance of power among tribes and European settlers. However, this reliance on European goods sometimes led to a decline in traditional practices and skills, as dependence on new technologies grew. In agriculture, some indigenous communities incorporated European farming techniques and crops like wheat and barley alongside their traditional methods. This blending of agricultural knowledge increased food production and supported population growth. However, these adaptations were often driven by necessity, as European colonization disrupted land ownership and resource availability, forcing indigenous peoples to navigate complex challenges while striving to maintain their cultural identities. Trade, diplomacy, and power. Indigenous groups became intermediaries in trade between European settlers and other tribes, creating new economic opportunities but also intensifying competition. The influx of European goods, such as beads, firearms, and alcohol, shifted indigenous social structures and power balances. Some tribes leveraged these goods to strengthen their positions, while others resisted, seeking to preserve their traditional ways of life. Trade negotiations often involved indigenous leaders asserting their sovereignty through diplomacy. Some tribes adeptly adapted European diplomatic forms to their own cultural needs, using language and negotiation styles that appealed to settlers while maintaining their identity. Cultural exchange and missionary impact. Cultural exchange between indigenous peoples and Europeans was significant. Indigenous knowledge of agriculture, local ecosystems, and medicinal resources was crucial for early colonial survival. In return, indigenous groups adopted European technologies and goods, altering their practices and lifestyles, though they often retained core cultural elements. The establishment of missions, particularly by the Spanish in the 16th century, aimed to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. This process affected indigenous governance, social structures, and traditions. Missions often imposed European agricultural practices, replacing traditional methods and altering diets. Indigenous peoples were sometimes forced to work lands for European benefit, disrupting social organization. Traditional leadership structures were often undermined as missionaries appointed leaders aligned with European customs. This caused divisions within communities between converts and those who resisted. European legal systems and governance further complicated indigenous autonomy, often disregarding indigenous custom. Missions also imposed European religious practices and languages, suppressing indigenous spiritual beliefs and cultural identity. Indigenous music and storytelling adapted to include European themes, sometimes diluting their original significance. Moreover, European diseases brought catastrophic population declines, leading to labor shortages that missions sought to address by integrating indigenous peoples, often under harsh and exploitative conditions. Indigenous resistance and leadership. Throughout colonization, many indigenous leaders demonstrated courage and strategic acumen in resisting conquest. Hatui, a Taino leader, organized guerrilla resistance against the Spanish in the early 16th century, using the Caribbean forests to launch surprise attacks. Though captured and executed, his resistance inspired others. Manco Inca Yupanqui led a major rebellion against the Spanish in the 1530 SS, using knowledge of Andean geography and ambush tactics to disrupt Spanish forces, fostering unity among indigenous groups. Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader in the early 19th century, travelled extensively to unite tribes against American settlers, advocating a confederation to preserve indigenous ways of life. He was ultimately killed in the War of 1812. Cochise, Apache leader, opposed American expansion using hit-and-run tactics and negotiated treaties to protect his people, reflecting a blend of warfare and diplomacy. Sitting Bull, a Sioux leader, played a key role in late 19th century resistance against U.S. government policies, rallying tribes against settlers and military forces. Evolution of the concept of race. The concept of race evolved significantly during European colonization of the Americas, shaped by social, economic and ideological factors. Europeans initially encountered diverse indigenous peoples, but began to categorize them into simplified racial groups to justify domination and exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade introduced Africans to the Americas as enslaved laborers, who were racialized and deemed inferior to rationalize their oppression. Plantation economies in the Caribbean and southern colonies relied heavily on enslaved African labor, reinforcing racial hierarchies. The Enlightenment paradoxically both advocated human rights and reinforced racial classifications, with some thinkers promoting pseudo-scientific theories of racial superiority and inferiority. These ideologies influenced colonial laws, social norms, and education systems. Intermarriage and cultural exchange created mixed-race identities, but colonial societies often enforced racial purity and social boundaries, institutionalizing systemic racism based on skin color and ancestry. Environmental impact of colonization. European colonization profoundly affected the environment and biodiversity in the Americas. The introduction of non-native species such as wheat, rice, sugarcane, pigs, cattle and horses often displaced native flora and fauna that had evolved in isolation. Large-scale land conversion for agriculture and settlement caused deforestation, soil depletion and habitat destruction, disrupting delicate ecosystems. The spread of European diseases weakened indigenous populations who had traditionally managed the environment, leading to further ecological imbalance. New farming techniques favoured monoculture and intensive farming, reducing biodiversity and transforming landscapes into fragmented fields and settlements. The fur trade, driven by European demand, led to overhunting of species like beavers, depleting wildlife populations. Finally, plantation agriculture, especially in the Caribbean and southern United States, entrenched an exploitative economic system with lasting social and environmental consequences. European colonization of the Americas brought profound changes to indigenous peoples, their lands and cultures. Indigenous leaders often used diplomacy to assert sovereignty, adapting European negotiation methods while preserving their identities. Cultural exchanges included sharing agricultural techniques and medicinal knowledge, vital to early settlers' survival. Conversely, indigenous societies adopted European technologies, altering lifestyles but retaining core traditions. The establishment of missions, especially by the Spanish in the 16th century, aimed to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, dramatically reshaping their social, cultural, and economic lives. European agricultural practices replaced traditional methods, often disrupting indigenous food systems and social structures. Missions imposed new leadership, legal systems, and religious customs, sometimes suppressing indigenous spirituality and causing cultural loss. The introduction of European diseases led to devastating population declines, forcing many into mission labor under harsh conditions. Indigenous resistance was strong and varied. Leaders like Hatuei, Inca Emperor Manco Inca, Tecumseh, Cochise, and Sitting Bull used military tactics and diplomacy to defend their peoples and territories against European and later American expansion. Their efforts symbolize resilience and the struggle for sovereignty. Colonial powers imposed racial classifications to justify exploitation, particularly of African enslaved peoples, shaping systemic racism that endures. Intermarriage and cultural mixing created complex identities. Though colonial societies enforced rigid racial hierarchies, environmental impacts were severe. European-introduced crops, livestock, and farming practices caused deforestation, soil erosion, and biodiversity loss. Plantation agriculture relied on enslaved labor, transforming ecosystems and economies with long-lasting effects. The legacy of conquest is complex, marked by cultural blending, economic transformation, and enduring inequalities for indigenous communities. Today, movements for indigenous rights emphasize reconciliation, cultural preservation, and addressing historical injustices. Contemporary scholarship highlights indigenous agency and the multifaceted nature of conquest, encouraging a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of history.